Hi, I'm Sabina and this is Zest, a podcast about writing with people who have no choice but to write. Today's guest is Tara Skurtu, a Boston-based poet, writer, teacher, and public speaker. Tara is a two-time Fulbright grantee and the recipient of 2 Academy of American Poets Prizes and the Robert Pinsky Global Fellowship in Poetry. She's the author of the Amoeba Game, translated as Jocul the Amoeba. Tara currently lives in Bucharest, and we sat down over coffee in her lovely apartment to talk about writing, poetry, creativity games, and one of her favorite objects in the world. Hi, Tara.
Hello.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview.
Thank you for having me, Sabina.
How are you today?
I'm good. I can't complain.
It's a lovely sunny day.
It is finally. Bucharest has been very dreary for those of you who have not seen Bucharest recently.
So, what are you doing these days?
What am I not doing these days is more the question. I am writing and teaching writing and traveling and giving readings and doing things like this podcast and doing laundry and
laundry is important.
Trying to teach myself how to get more sleep so I can be even more efficient.
You strike me as a very creative person. First time I saw you at the Power of Storytelling conference here in Bucharest a few years back. And ever since then, whenever I had an interaction with you online, because we haven't met in person till now, you always strike me as very creative. And I was wondering if there's anything you do to train that creative muscle?
Thank you for saying that. I think I'm doing things every day to train that creative muscle. First of all, I think everybody is creative. And this is something when I teach writing. I remember the first class I ever taught at Boston University, I had a student who was studying math. And he said out loud, "I don't think I'm a creative person." And that really got me thinking. And then I started thinking about poetry and how kids love poetry. They're not intimidated by it. And then by the time they're done with school, high school or college, they're intimidated by it, or they think they're not poetry people, or when they start writing, the writing is very general, or they think they're not creative. And I think what happens is we have to constantly be aware of what we see, hear, feel, touch, taste, to try to experience things as if we've never experienced them before, because we've seen so many things and experienced so many things by the time we're grown-ups. And I do little things like when I'm walking around, I look up a lot. A lot of people don't do that. You see so much more when you look up. And just looking around. And I have a game that I play called the Ceiling Game. And this is like a big part of how, when I'm feeling very stuck, I will play this game. I came up with this game with my brother and sister when I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment with my dad. You get a mirror and you hold it at chest level and you look down, and what happens is the ceiling becomes the floor. Now this could be a dangerous game, so so don't play it near stairs. I have to give a public service announcement. I will not be responsible for anyone getting hurt playing the ceiling game. No, but for real, you hold it at the level that's good for you, and you just try to pretend you don't have peripheral vision, and you look into that mirror, you look down, and you start walking around. And it's really best to do this in a place you know. And this also has to do with looking up, because it completely changes your perspective. And what happens is you have to step over invisible obstacles, like a doorway, or you walk around things like a ceiling fan that looks like it can chop you up. And I play this game actually when I teach creative writing, when I give workshops. It's usually the last thing I do. And I do it first so people won't feel as embarrassed. But what's really interesting is that even when people are being watched and they know they're being watched, they will still step over all the doorways, the invisible doorways on the floor. And everybody laughs. And I think that laughter is like a reset button for creativity, because it's the opposite of self-consciousness. So that's an example of what I do to remind myself I'm creative.
And you said you think everyone can be creative. Do you think anyone can be a writer?
I think everyone is creative, and I think everyone can write. I think, can everyone be a writer? That's a tricky thing. I think everyone can be a writer, but can everyone be a good writer? I don't think so. But then you have the word good, which is also subjective. If you send a poem to 10 different magazines, or if you give a story to 10 different people for feedback, someone you really trust might tell you that story's done. 9 other people might tell you you need to make changes or it doesn't work. So there's a certain amount of faith and trust that goes into your work. And a lot of that comes from the editing process and developing craft. But bringing us back to good writing, I think, simple, specific, but there's also a logic. involved. And I think people who are wired to write are writers. There's a need to write, especially with poetry, because I've talked to my first poetry teacher and very dear friend, Lloyd Schwartz, one time in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in his car. We were talking about poetry. And at one point, we just said, you know what? Every poem I've ever written, I didn't want to write. There's a need. It's not just about the writing. It's about what happens before the writing and what happens throughout your whole life, because it's about how you perceive and take in information and then synthesize that information and then choose what parts of it are in a logic that needs to become a narrative. And you're never fully in control of this. You're always never really knowing exactly what you're doing, but there's some kind of thing that's guiding you, and then the tools you develop for editing and how to draft better drafts, they help.
So we talked about it a bit before starting, that you say that poetry, you figure out poetry, like it happens in your head before writing it.
Oh yeah, I said that recently too in a tweet where I figured out part of a poem in the shower. And you'd think that I would be in the shower 24/7 if it means I could figure out poems. And then
someone could write many books.
Someone was like, well, you can't do that. You have to moisturize.
How do you think that happens? Do you have to have like an intention to write, and then the brain knows and it figures things out based on your observations?
Okay, so how do you figure out a poem? I think the key word is intention. I think it's very much like trying to remember a dream. To me, poetry is very much like dreams and math. The logic is very similar, I think. But as far as dreams go, you know how when you have a dream, maybe you wake up in the middle of the night and you remember it and you go back to sleep. And during that day, you can't remember the dream, but there's something that's so close. You're so close to remembering it, but you feel the dream. And then you're talking to a friend and you're like, oh, I had this dream. And then somehow, like 15, 20 minutes later, the dream comes to you. And there was an intention, right? Like you thought about it, you activated something about figuring out that dream. And then your brain, some part of your brain kicked in that you weren't in control of, but it started with intention. And then you figured it out. And so I think like brainstorming, coming up with ideas, it starts with some kind of intention, but the figuring out also comes in little brief moments of relaxation in which your brain is in the in-between state, which I think is why everyone says you get ideas in the shower. I think it's very true, because it's this moment of space in between things where you take a moment. I really do believe that so much of writing happens before you write. And the first person that ever told me this was a high school teacher. And I remember thinking, yeah, right, this like essay is not going to write itself. But it's so true. And that's how I write poems, where I have a moment and I think this is going to end up in a poem, but I don't know how. And then sometimes there will be another moment, and then I can connect those moments, but I still don't know how to write the poem. But I activate something, and then my brain starts working on it, and then I start writing it, and that thing continues. That's some kind of mechanism. I feel like it's somewhere in the back of your head. I mean, it's really the same thing you use in learning, like, because I felt the same thing when I was taking a number of intriguing undergraduate courses where I was learning new things every day, and not just that, but getting ideas based on new things I was learning. And writing is like getting ideas based on new experiences. I think it's many things. You can't define it.
But you have to be open to it in order for that to happen.
Of course. And I think if any writer that tries to control a piece of writing is going to write really boring work and is never going to discover or surprise themselves. And writing is all about discovery. Every time I'm writing something, I'm thinking, I don't quite know where this is going to end up, even if I have a feeling. And then I just start working on it line by line. Every time I finish something, I feel anxious about it. I don't know if it will work. I listen to one person in the whole world, but I take the advice of several others. And then when I realize it works, it's a complete object. It's leave aloneable. I think, I don't know how I did that. I hope I can do it again. And I used to get worried that I wouldn't be able to do it again, but now I know that I will. But I also know I won't know how the whole time I'm doing it, which is also kind of beautiful.
It's like when you learn to drive or walk, you do it and you're not even sure how you're doing it.
Yeah. Writing is like...
It works somehow.
Yeah. It's
but
totally...
if you think about the process, you're screwing it up. If you try to decompose it, like the steps you're taking or how you ride a bike, how you're doing it, if you think about it, you're going to fall.
Yeah. It's like you're right. Writing is just like experiencing something for the first time. Also reading poetry. Some of the best advice I ever got was read your poems as if you're experiencing them for the first time. As much as you can do this, because it's impossible because of memory. But it actually makes a difference, because a lot of people read their poems as if they're bored with them.
You also teach creative writing and poetry. Creative writing, I get in a way, but how do you teach poetry?
Yeah, this is like the question, the impossibility of teaching poetry. But actually, poetry, I always say, is storytelling. If you think about it that way, well, how do you teach storytelling? Everybody knows how to tell stories. So we're actually back to the beginning of our conversation, where we were talking about how everyone is creative. You don't teach creativity, but some people may think they're not creative. Some people may think they don't know how to tell a story, or they don't have a voice, or they don't know how to write a poem. Well, I didn't know how to write a poem at first. And when someone suggested to me, you should write a poem and submit it to this contest, because they actually thought I was a poet and they realized it before I did. I was journaling at the time. I first thought, well, I can't write a poem. I don't know anything about sonnets or form or meter or rhyme. And then ultimately, I went back to an experience that made me feel so much and had conflict. And I actually didn't know how to handle this experience any other way. It was visiting my sister in prison. And I just started writing the story of visiting her in prison. And at first, of course, I wrote it rather poetically. And I think in the first draft, which I have somewhere, it has something about a Greek reference, which thank God I took out. But I wrote that story, and it didn't have rhyme. It didn't have meter. And it turns out, I worked on it for a long time, but it's one of the strongest poems I've ever written, and I had no idea. So teaching creative writing is a lot about teaching the ways we've learned we think we should write, and actually giving exercises that remind people how to be specific, which seems strange, but a lot of times, most of the time when people start writing poems, for instance, in a workshop with me, the poems can be about anyone, any place, any time. It's universal love, it's universal loss, but they're actually about nothing. And it's this safe zone, but sometimes people think it needs to be universal for people to be able to relate to it. Whereas if I come home from work and I'm like, hey, I'm going to tell you about my boring walk home, versus, hey, I was walking home and I was in the middle of a crosswalk and I almost got killed by a car. That's the kind of story I'm going to tell you. Something that stands out and is specific. And it's not the same story that someone else has experienced. It might be similar, or it might remind them of an experience or of a relationship or of a moment in their past. And so I teach specificity, how to be specific. Also, I teach basically vacuuming unnecessary parts out of sentences. What makes a good sentence? Well, a good sentence is, I'm looking at this thing and I'm describing it, and you're going to see something as close to possible as this thing. If I call it a beautiful painting and I ask 10 different people, tell me your first association with a beautiful painting. What do you see? I'm going to get a lot of different things. So it's parts of sentences, how to be specific. Also just like exercises about how to open your mind up and just to think stream of consciously, and to not worry about, I need to have a voice, this needs to be perfect, I don't know what I'm doing. So I'm dealing a lot with fear. Well, the first thing I address is always fear, because it's fear that keeps you from doing anything that matters, things that are nagging at you. And writing is actually a really hard thing, writing well. And so there's a lot of fear about writing. It's in two categories. How am I going to get these thoughts into words? How am I going to be able to express myself the way I want to? And also, like, what are people going to think? What if it's crap? So it's like the process of getting it from your brain onto the page, and the process of having it go from the page to the reader. So I think about all this, and I work with all this, and I work with fears, and I come up with creative exercises that sometimes don't even have to do with writing, but they do.
Mm-hmm. They probably have to do with opening up, right? Mm-hmm. And doing things you're uncomfortable with.
Yep. A lot of it is just creating a certain space, but with editing principles and revision guidance. And also, I work a lot with memory. I guess this is my area of specialty when it comes to teaching creative writing. We have a wealth of narratives in our experiences that are not ones anyone else has experienced, even if we've experienced them together. They're different, what we remember.
Yeah. So, but how did you learn to do all this?
I would not be where I am today if I hadn't taken a poetry workshop. I took my first poetry workshop when I was studying English, Spanish, and pre-med at the same time and preparing to go to medical school. I had been feeling the need to write poetry for a long time. And as soon as I realized that I was focusing on a practical career, I thought, oh, I can take a poetry workshop on the side. But I took a workshop, and it was the first time that I had peer feedback, but the peer feedback wasn't the important part at the time. I had feedback from, and I'm mentioning him again, Lloyd Schwartz, who hands down is the best line-by-line editor I've ever met in my life, and one of the most generous, kind people in the world alive today. And he's a Pulitzer Prize winning music critic, and he doesn't read music. So talking about how did you learn this? A lot of times it's part instinct with writing. So it's part instinct, and then it's part developing a toolkit. The first poem I ever gave Lloyd, when I got it back, it was covered in so much ink that I thought, oh my God, I suck. But what happened was he saw that I had potential, and he saw little nuggets of strength in this poem. And he also saw that I was being very sentimental, which is what happens when you start writing poems. And he told me what wasn't working and why it wasn't working. And then he told me what was working and why it was working. And then he taught me things like something I use today. So a lot of the teaching I use today, of course, we get from teachers we've had. And I think Jill McDonough and Lloyd Schwartz and Robert Pinsky and Louise Glick, I was lucky to study with these poets. I've learned the most from them. Oh, and Frank Bedart. Frank Bedart taught me about asterisks, these little star punctuation marks that don't change anything about the text, but they change the text drastically, space-wise. It puts time in the text in between the lines. Basically, I have a treasure chest of things I've learned from the people I've studied from, combined with instinct and practice.
You said you had been journaling before writing poetry. Had you been doing that a long time?
Oh yeah, since I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And I still do it, although I've been neglecting it lately. I think just about every single poem I've ever gotten has come out of something that I have journaled.
How does that work? Do you do it every day?
No, I don't write every day, and I'm not a proponent of writing every day. Some people think you have to, and they put a lot of pressure on that. And for people who can write every day, I think that's fantastic. For people who try to write a good poem or story every day, I think that's impossible, at least for me. It's funny, I went to a cafe last night, and I recognized a face, and it was a girl who had taken a workshop with me like 2 years ago. And I asked her if she was writing, and she said, I stopped writing poetry. And I said, why? And she said, I had a bad experience and I don't want to write about the person. And I said, but actually, you wouldn't necessarily be writing about the person. You would be writing about your experience. I write things down when I have experiences that I feel like need to be written down, or else I will forget them. Because if you don't write something down, you always forget, no matter if you have a great memory. We don't have a movie of our lives, so we have to document moments. So that's what I do. I document moments that stand out. And I also write myself through difficult times. I have written myself through every difficult time. Writing is a coping mechanism as well. Mm-hmm. Storytelling is a coping mechanism. Humor is a coping mechanism. Storytelling with humor, fantastic combination.
If you can do it, it's great.
Yeah.
And sometimes you even rewrite your story. You reframe stuff when you write. It's therapeutic in a way.
Oh yeah,
because you can rewrite it. You can see it from a new angle.
Yeah, and I mean you can combine memories. I mean, who's going to read a poem and be like Tara Skurtu? That's not a single memory of yours. That comes from 2 different days. No one's going to do that. So. And I also, when you were asking me about how I've learned, so when Lloyd, for instance, would tell me, I mean, I still send my poems to Lloyd, and now it's actually full circle, which is really beautiful, as he sends his poems to me now. We both send our poems to each other. But when he tells me something isn't working and tells me why, that's very different than prescriptive advice. I'm not a firm believer in prescriptive advice. This line's not working, you absolutely need to do this. Because part of being a good editor is noticing when something doesn't click. But you're not the writer of that piece when you're editing someone else's work. So you have an obligation to work with that voice and also not to control that voice.
Let's talk a bit more about editing, because I think it's a very important part of the writing.
Editing. Am I allowed to say cuss words?
Of course.
Oh, okay. Because I totally didn't do this on purpose, but it's become the quote that I am known for. I edit like a motherfucker. And it's so true.
What does it mean?
Let's just say I spend a lot of time editing and reading aloud and thinking about a word, thinking about words next to each other, thinking about a line, thinking about how the meaning goes with the words I chose and the sound. And I stay in this process. And to me, it's a very comforting, calming, peaceful process. And I love it. I love getting that draft 11, draft 12, draft 13. So think of writing like ice skating. Say you just take me and you throw me out. I mean, I know how to skate, but I don't know how to figure skate. And say you just take me and you throw me out into a skating rink and tell me to do some tricks and picture what I'm going to look like when I try to do some tricks versus say I had then looked like a fool and wanted to do some serious, nice tricks. And I spent 5 years. You don't have to spend 5 years on a poem. Sometimes you do. And then I went back out there. The difference. And writing a poem, especially a poem, is actually like that because it's not the most natural object, but it looks natural when you get the final draft. But a lot of people are scared of editing and revising. And also revising is different than editing. Editing is very technical, but revising to see again, maybe you move parts around. Maybe you switch stanza 2 and 4 and it works better. Maybe you have to completely take something out and replace it with something else. Maybe the logic changes. Revision is a very open-ended process. It's a formative process.
Why do you think people are afraid of that?
I think, people are afraid of having their voice changed, of having the work, maybe the work won't be my own. And I think it also depends where you are in the world because, where I'm from, we have a lot of master's programs in creative writing and it's a profession. The emphasis tends to be on the editing process and the final product is often rather edited. Here, we're in Bucharest right now, and in many other places, because I've traveled around at poetry festivals and I talk about writing all the time, in some parts of the world, the focus tends to be on the inspiration and the initial drafts. But I do think that not editing is fear-based. Because once you start doing it, you realize it's a different thing. You don't want to be in control when you're writing, the inspiration draft. But there is a control involved in the editing process. Because you switch into, it's a completely different process. I'm sure if you were to hook someone's brain up, I always think about this. I would love, if there are any scientists that ever want to do a poetry study, please contact me. I'm serious about this, though. I even talked to a neuroscientist when I did a TED Talk in Transylvania, and he was interested in this. Of hooking people's brains up while they are writing a draft, while they are editing a draft, and then while they're reading poetry, not their own, just a poem. Because I think it lights up so many areas of the brain, and I think that the different processes light up different areas of the brain. So I think that it's just, there's a fear about that process. But once you enter into that process, just like once you enter into writing, when you're scared to write something, that fear is not the same fear. It lifts a bit. Sometimes all the way. Mm. Most of the poetry I read, I actually don't like. But I can tell when people really spend time on poetry. That said, because it's such a profession and a field of study in the US, the other end of the spectrum is sometimes you see these very crafted poems. The form is great, but the content is completely empty. That annoys me too. So maybe one downside of having writing not be a professional field, creative writing, is that you don't get as much editing and you get some poems that could be much stronger that are published and books that could be much stronger. But on the other hand, there's so much emphasis on craft that sometimes you just get complete empty shells.
You have to strike a balance somehow. And probably you can't do that on your own. You need somebody else to take a look.
I think you always need someone else to take a look, and who that person is important. Mentorships are very important because you don't need to have access to a master's program to have someone help you out with your work. Back to how my work started getting strong in this first poetry workshop I took. I got feedback and then I revised my work and then I got feedback on the revisions. And I teach poetry and creative writing here. And I had one person that said, well, how do you know? How will you know the process and how will you know how to get to the finalized state? And you know it by going through it. And so this person became very, very patient, and I'm very picky. So the person that was writing poetry, she worked on her poems, I think for about a year before she got something that was really leave-aloneable. And now she loves the editing process. And now her drafts are stronger because there's a patience that is also needed.
There are different skills you need to cultivate.
Yeah. And it also makes you more confident in other areas of your life. It makes you a better communicator. I mean, creative writing is so important. I've gone into corporations and taught workshops on creative writing, and they're actually workshops on communication and leadership and confidence. I mean, creative writing is a part of every aspect of our lives.
But most people think it's not for them.
Yeah, sometimes. Most people think they don't like poetry, and then I read them this Andrea Cohen poem called The Committee Weighs In. I won't read it here. Look it up. I bring this poem with me everywhere I go in the world. In less than 30 seconds, just picture that brain hooked up to a machine.
Lighting up.
Because it will happen. And people who tell me they don't like poetry, I always read them that poem.
I hope you're enjoying the interview. In case you need to pause, don't forget to come back to find out why people say they don't like poetry and what poets Tara recommends. If you're listening to this podcast on your desktop or in a browser, my advice is to try it out on your mobile, in a dedicated app. I like Spotify, but you can use iTunes, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, and other similar apps. The advantage is that you can listen on the go and always pick up where you left off. And now, back to Tara's amazing stories. Why do you think people say they don't like poetry?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with school, because I think also there are great poets from hundreds of years ago, but a lot of times we are only taught the work of these great poets from 100 years ago, hundreds of years ago, and they spoke differently than us. Sometimes the spelling is different. Sometimes the meaning of the words is different. It's kind of like having something behind glass. And I say behind glass also because a lot of times the teachers teaching these poems might not like them or might not understand them or think they need to be understood one particular way. And whenever that happens, it's not usually the way the author meant it, in my experience. So I think that what happens is people just back off. Also, I think there are a lot of poems that are trying to be clever. People write a lot of poems that try to be smarter than you. I think poems that are really vague, sometimes because they're afraid to write about something. And I think that when people say they don't like poetry, they just need to read some conversational poems, because there are a lot of them.
Can you recommend a few poets?
Putting me on the spot. Poets? No, I thought you were going to say poems.
Let's say somebody who's not into that much into poetry, but would like to discover it.
This is a hard question because people look for different elements and aspects of poetry. So like my favorite poet in the world is Elizabeth Bishop, and I love also Lucille Clifton. But I know that Elizabeth Bishop, she would spend years and years and years on a poem, and you have to be patient reading her poems because it's like diving down to something, but then at the end of the poem, you're like, all of a sudden, you've panned out and you have this marvelous view of everything. So I tell people Elizabeth Bishop, she's kind of like beer. She's an acquired taste sometimes. Not everyone likes beer at first. Not everyone likes beer ever. As far as super candid, conversational, I will write about anything, I don't give a fuck, in the best way possible poet, I would say Jill McDonough. I lived in Boston, and Boston is just a wealth of poetry, history, and great contemporary poetry. I love Gwendolyn Brooks, Frank Bidart, Lucille Clifton. I'm not naming all Boston poets, by the way. Ilya Kaminsky. And then I would say, what are some other poets if you were returning to poetry or coming to poetry for the first time? Andrea Cohen, she's one of my favorite poets in the whole world. She writes these short little poems. I mentioned her earlier. They're like, oh man, they're fierce, but they're quiet. And they're tiny, a lot of them. Jericho Brown, Ariel Francisco. He's a young poet who just had his first poem in the New Yorker last month. And he reminds me of a contemporary, super matter-of-fact, Frank O'Hara-ish voice. Albanian-born American poet Anijika, who is also a marvelous translator of poetry. Mary Ruefle, she's interesting. And she writes great little non-essay essays that will give you inspiration and make you think. I think that's an okay list, but I feel like It's also a bad list because there's so many more things I like that I didn't include, and poets.
Okay. I'm sure anyone who wants to read more poetry can take something from the list and give it a chance. And then they'll discover it themselves.
Yeah.
And they can follow you on Twitter, and you always retweet nice poems and
Twitter is great for the writing community, and I really believe in connecting people that do good things, and I love sharing the work of writers, and I just think it's the perfect medium for doing that, and Twitter should be paying me for PR for the amount of people I've gotten to join and taught.
I love Twitter as well. I think here in Romania it's not that big, but I love it. I think it's
you and I met on Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. So we talked about you teaching poetry. You said people need patience. So what advice would you give to someone starting writer?
I mean, the thing that just came to mind when you said that is to keep writing, keep writing, keep writing. Write through your fears, write through your doubts. Even if you start writing, I don't know what I'm writing about. This is crap, this is crap, this is crap. Write it down until something else comes. It's really about getting started. It's like getting on a treadmill for your brain. It's like, just start doing a free write, put the pen down and just write. Or think about one moment of your day and maybe write half a sentence or a word that you're thinking about and just start writing. And I guarantee you, within a certain number of minutes, you're going to be writing about something specific.
You mentioned before we started the interview that you're working on something different these days, writing for the gaming industry.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
I never would have guessed this in 1,000 years, but I'm now also a game writer.
How does that work?
Well, it's funny, like the job just kind of fell into my lap. And so now I'm working at this startup that's been developing a game for a while. It's a very complicated game. It has a lot of elements that don't exist in other games. And I am in charge of writing the scripts and revising the scripts. And it's the most challenging job I've ever had because I'm writing for all of these different demands and limitations, like for the game mechanics, or for the animations, or for how we have to tie a story to a game, to a place, it's very tricky. And you have to do all of this, all of the character dialogue within a certain number of characters. And then you have to hit enter. It's like writing a poem that's not a prose poem. Except for I'm putting things in these lines that sometimes make me cringe when I'm thinking about writing good poetry. So it's a challenge every day. And also writing prompts for the games and outcomes and the whole logic. But it's actually the same process or a very similar process as writing a poem or a story. And this is the thing, and this is why I teach in creative writing, no matter what. I have clients that come in and they're writing essays about their lives. Sometimes they're writing short stories. Sometimes they're writing poems. Sometimes they have no idea what they need to write, and I help them figure it out. But it's all the same thing. Even academic writing is creative writing. How many times have you had to write an essay that you didn't want to write? And then you get to the end of it. Wow, I was pretty clever. How did I do that? That's creative writing. It's all the same process.
Do you find it easier to write for this game because you know exactly what you need to write?
No, I find it the most challenging writing I've ever done in my life, actually, even though I'm not proud of it in the same way as I'm proud of a poem. Like when I finish a poem, it's like this object that I wouldn't change. But I think what I like about this job so much is the game industry. I read about this before when I started the job, because I didn't really play games before, and I didn't know a lot about games, and they were looking for a writer whose native language was English, and I was teaching creative writing to somebody affiliated with the company. So they recommended me. And the thing I read was that game writing and the game industry, you're in a constant state of revision. Like every day things are changing, every day. And so I basically found a job where I'm in a constant state of revision in editing, which are two of my favorite things to do, and writing little short lines. And the hardest part is writing these conversational lines that border on a little bit like clever and cheesy, but not too cheesy so that you cringe. And that's really hard. It's very challenging. So I'm writing and then I leave the office and then I teach writing and I help people, edit and revise their writing, all ages. And I've taught in prisons, I've taught in investment banks, I just don't have enough time. the one thing I want to do next, which was my original idea here with my company, is to teach workshops in corporations here. I had started doing that in the US, and the only reason I'm not doing it yet is because I haven't had time. If anyone in Romania wants them, feel free to contact me. It'll help me get going.
You enjoy teaching?
I love teaching. Teaching and writing poetry, they're the only two things where I don't even think about time. That's how I know I love them.
Do you have a favorite place where you write?
Well, writing is hard enough to do, so I try to train myself to be able to write anywhere. But I write at my desk. Sometimes I write on my couch, although I prefer to have a good writing position. Sometimes I write at bars or cafes. I can write anywhere unless the person next to me is having a loud conversation that I can't block out. And actually being here helps me because I'm learning Romanian, I'm teaching myself. I've even translated some poems, but I can still tune it out. So it can easily go from me understanding it to becoming blah, 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 which helps with me writing. Whereas if I were listening to an English conversation 1 foot away from me, I would probably not be able to work on a poem. So here I feel like extra free when I'm writing.
We have a beautiful painting here. Do you mind talking about it?
No, I would love to talk about it because I get to talk about another really amazing human, which I love to do. So, this is such a challenge because you have to describe what something looks like to people who can't see it. So I have this framed digital art print that looks kind of like an echocardiogram, like a crazy echocardiogram with maybe a lot of tachycardia, crazy heartbeat rates, and all over the place. And in between these peaks and lows is like an entire color palette, like a pastel blue, a mustard yellow, a bright yellow, a pastel pink, a dark bright blue. And the echocardiogram part of this is actually from text. And this is an artist named Henry Mandel. He's an American artist, and he makes these huge digital prints. And I highly recommend looking them up. They're quite striking. And this is a miniature version. This is a copy made just for me. It's the only one that exists like this. And it's actually the entire text of my poem, The Amoeba Game. And it's called Amoeba Game. And I have it above my desk. And it's really calming for me to look at. And I love it because I feel like it's like this secret that only I have the code to. Mm-hmm. And it's one of my favorite 2 objects in the world. Henry Mandel.
How did he translate the words into the colors or the
I don't know, shape? But I know he started with the Word doc. I gave him a Word doc of my poem. The letters, I mean, you can't tell that they're letters at all. You can't even tell where the poem starts and ends. You would never guess it was based on text. He recently did one with an Emily Dickinson poem that's really big and it's gorgeous. It's like mostly black and white. And it's about time. So he stretches the letters. I mean, the letters are stretched long and just warped. Mm-hmm. And you don't even know that they're letters. But it's the entire text of a poem.
It is beautiful. And it really fits with your setting.
Yeah. I'm really lucky to have it.
I can see how that's an inspiration when you write. Also, maybe knowing that it's something that you worked on and you finished it and having that knowledge.
Yeah, and to see that like one type of art become another type of art, but they contain each other. And that's what art does. I mean, it's a transfer. I mean, even looking at art, it's a transfer. You look at it, you get a feeling, and the feeling is inside you from looking at this thing. Back to how I said poetry reminds me of math. You have like an asymptote. It's like a word continuously approaching a given feeling, but it never quite reaches it at any finite distance. And I think that this art really does play with that because it's really literally taking the text and stretching it into something else. And it comes so close to being something completely different, but the text is still there. And then that text is trying to describe a story, which is trying to capture a feeling, which brings us to the essence of language, which is naming something to try to express something, but it never does it 100%.
Mm-hmm. It's beautiful.
Thanks for asking me about that because he's a really great artist and this is a really special thing on my wall.
We're getting close to the end of the interview. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if to conclude it, because we already talked about one of your poems, could you maybe read one of your poems?
Sure. I feel like now I should read the Amoeba Game. It's the title poem of my book. I think I'm going to read the Amoeba Game.
Sounds good.
The funny thing about this poem is I actually originally wanted it to be a short story and it just turned into a poem, but it's a short story. Mm-hmm. The Amoeba Game I stood at the stove, holding a wooden spoon in my right hand, listening to butter sputtering against the splattered circle of an egg. Perhaps it was the flapping of the egg's wavy edges against the steel pan, or the amorphousness of its innards outside the carriage of its brown shell. I remembered an odd game I played in brownies. The Amoeba Game. In the front yard of the scout cabin, one girl at a time would become an amoeba and lead the rest. We didn't know what amoebas were, only that they weren't human or animal and moved like 1,000 blind legs treading through molasses. So it was that our heads and arms became legs and feet, undulating wayward into dusk. Swaying our shoulders left to right, we'd giggle through mouths we weren't supposed to have, pretending we had no eyes and didn't know where we came from or where we were going. This is a game that I really want to play with adults, and I think I'm going to make it happen sometime really soon.
That would be really interesting.
It is also, to me, like a representation of poetry and the act of writing. And it's freeing, and it's about community.
That's very nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was great.
This is your host, Sabina Varga. The visual identity is created by Silviana. Zest is a weekly podcast published on Wednesdays. Stay tuned by subscribing in your favorite app or on Black Sense. You'll get a weekly email with updates. Thanks for listening. Bye!